The three words that destroy your entire life are spoken in a voice you don't even recognize. Who are you? You're standing on the porch of the most expensive house on the street, but you feel like a thief. You spent 20 years of your life, 7,000 nights of overtime, and thousands of hours in a cold New York warehouse just to pay for the marble floors under your feet. You imagined this moment every single day while eating cheap bread in a cramped apartment in Queens. You thought when the door opened, you'd finally be the hero. But the door swings open, and a tall young man stands there. He's 19 years old. He's wearing the designer hoodie you sent him for his birthday. He's holding the phone you paid for. You wait for the hug. You wait for the tears. But he just tilts his head, looks at your tired, gray face, and asks you that question like you're a stranger selling something at the door. Does it hurt? It should. Because in that second, you realized the American dream was a trap. You worked 20 years to give him a future, but you became a ghost in his present. You gave him everything he ever wanted, but you took away the only thing he actually needed, you. You thought you were building a legacy, but you were actually just paying for your own replacement. 20 years ago, you made a promise that felt like a holy vow. Do you remember that rainy night in your tiny apartment? The walls were thin, and the air smelled of struggle. You looked at your 2-year-old son sleeping in a crib you made from scrap wood. You looked at your bank account and saw nothing but zeros. You told yourself that love meant providing. You thought if you could just get to America, if you could just send back enough dollars, your son would grow up like a king. You took off your father's old steel watch and placed it next to his pillow. Every tick you hear is me working for you, you whispered. You felt so brave. You felt like a martyr. You didn't realize that the watch wasn't counting down to your return. It was counting down the death of your relationship. You walked out into the rain, got into a taxi, and flew halfway across the world. You promised your wife you'd be back in 2 years. You didn't know that 2 years is the biggest lie every immigrant tells himself to survive the first night alone. When you landed at JFK, the city didn't care about your sacrifice. New York didn't bow down to the father who left his child. You found yourself in a basement, washing dishes until your skin felt like wet paper. You worked in warehouses where the air was so cold it felt like glass in your lungs. Every time you wanted to quit, every time your back felt like it was snapping in half, you looked at the photo in your wallet. You saw the toddler. You didn't realize that the toddler was already disappearing. You were working for a ghost, and you were becoming one yourself. You remember the pride you felt when you sent that first check? $300? Your wife called you crying because the kids finally had meat for dinner every night. You felt like a god. You thought, see, I'm a great father. But were you? You were providing calories, but you weren't providing comfort. You were paying for the roof, but you weren't the one tucking them in. You used the money to silence the guilt screaming in your head. You convinced yourself that a full stomach was better than a father's hug. The years started to blur into a cycle of shifts and sleep. 2 years became 5. 5 became 10. You moved from the basement to a better job. You started a small business. You became a success. You finally built that big house back home, the one with the white pillars and the marble floors. You sent the latest iPhones, the best laptops, the most expensive sneakers. You became a legend in your village. But every time you called home, the silence on the other end got louder. Remember the first time he didn't want to talk to you? He was 8. You were on a video call trying to tell him you loved him, and he just looked bored. Thanks for the iPad, Dad. Can I go play now? It was a small sting then. You laughed it off. You told yourself he was just a kid. You didn't realize you were training him to love your money more than your soul. You were teaching him that Dad
was just a bank account that lived in a different time zone.
By the time he was 15, the calls were at shore. You would ask about his grades, he would give you one-word answers. You would tell him about your hard day at work, he would check his watch, the one you bought him. He didn't know about the lonely nights in Queens. He didn't know about the dinners you skipped so he could have the best private tutors. To him, you weren't a hero. You were a high-limit credit card. You were a ghost that lived in America and sent boxes of things. You thought you were building a bridge of gold, but you were actually building a wall made of $100 bills. And now, here you are, standing in the living room of the palace you financed. Your wife comes out. She looks at you with a mix of pity and sadness. She has spent 20 years being a single mother while you were providing. She has handled the fevers, the heartbreaks, and the rebellious years alone. She has learned to live without your voice, without your touch, without your help. She has built a life in the house you paid for, but there is no space left for you in it. You are the invisible man who finally showed up, expecting a parade that was never planned. Your son looks at his watch, the one you sent him last month. "Mom, I'm going out with my friends," he says. He doesn't even ask for your permission. Why would he? You haven't been an authority figure in his life since he was in diapers. He walks past you, and the smell of his expensive cologne fills your nose. It's the smell of your own failure. He gets into the car you bought him. He drives away on the tires you paid for. He doesn't look back in the rearview mirror. You walk through the house. It's quiet, too quiet. You look at the family photos on the walls. They're beautiful, they're professional, and you aren't in a single one of them. You're the guy who paid for the photographer. You're the guy who paid for the designer clothes they're wearing. But you aren't the guy in the frame. You are the space where a father should have been. Is this the success you wanted? You have the mansion. You have the respect of the people who don't know you. You have the bank account. But your son is a man now, and he doesn't know your story. He doesn't know your favorite song. He doesn't know the sound of your real laugh. You realize that in your race to give him everything, you actually gave him nothing. Because the only thing a child ever truly needs is a father who stays to watch them grow. You find the old watch you left 20 years ago. It's sitting in a drawer, dusty and forgotten. The ticking has stopped, just like the connection between you and your son. You sit down at the expensive dining table. You are finally home. You are finally done working. But as you look at the empty chairs, you realize the most terrifying truth of all. You worked 20 years to buy a house, but you ended up homeless in your own heart. The American dream told you that money equals happiness. It told you that sacrifice equals love. It lied to you. It took your youth, took your health, and it took your family. It gave you a pile of bricks and a shiny car in exchange for the 20 years you should have spent holding your son's hand. You want to run after him. You want to yell, "I did it for you!" But you know he won't understand. To him, you're just the man who was never there, the man who grew old in a different country, the man who is now a stranger in his own house. How does it feel to win the world and lose the only people who were supposed to be in it with you? This is the price of the dream. This is the reality of the sacrifice. You are finally home, but you are completely alone. And the worst part is, you can't even blame the system. You chose the money. You chose the distance. And now you have to live with the silence. You look in the mirror, and for the first time in 20 years, you ask yourself the same question your son just asked. Who are you? Have you ever noticed how a screen can be both a bridge and a wall?
For 20 years, your entire relationship with your family existed in a glowing rectangle. At first, the video calls were everything. You would sit in your tiny room in Queens, the walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's TV, and you would wait for the connection to be made. When your son's face finally appeared on the screen, your heart would soar. He was 2, then 3, then 4. He would press his sticky fingers against the glass, trying to touch your face, and you would do the same. You would tell him bedtime stories while the sun was still high in the New York sky. You were a father in pixels. You were a hero made of light. But as the months turned into years, the digital bridge started to crumble. You didn't notice it at first. It started with the lag, a 2-second delay between your "I love you" and his response. Then it was the distractions. Your son started looking past the camera. He was more interested in the cartoons on the TV behind him than the man talking to him from 3,000 miles away. You felt a sting, but you told yourself, he's just a kid. I'll make it up to him with a better gift. And that was your first major mistake. You started using the mall to fix the distance. You became the box from America. Every month you would go to a shipping office in the city, carrying heavy boxes filled with things you couldn't really afford. Designer sneakers, remote control cars, the newest gaming consoles. You thought you were sending love. You thought every time he opened a box and screamed with joy, he was thanking you for your sacrifice. But you weren't sending love. You were sending bribes. You were training your son to love the things you provided more than the person you were. You were making yourself replaceable. Because anyone can buy a toy, but only a father can be there to play with it. The calls became shorter. "How was school?" you would ask. "Fine," he would say, his eyes already drifting back to his game. "Did you like the new bike I sent?" "Yeah, it's cool, thanks, Dad." And that was it. 5 minutes of small talk, followed by a click and a black screen. You would sit in the silence of your apartment, the hum of the city outside feeling like a mockery. You had the money now. You were successful, but you were realizing that a video call is just a shadow of a relationship. You can see their eyes, but you can't feel their presence. You can hear their voice, but you can't hear their thoughts. You were becoming a legend in your home country, the man who made it big, but in your own house, you were just the guy who called on Sundays. Then came the identity shift. In New York, you were nobody. You were the man in the orange vest, the man with the sore back, the man who blended into the crowd on the 7 train. But when you sent the money home, you were a king. You loved the way people spoke about you back in the village. You loved the photos your wife sent of the new marble floors and the grand staircase. You became addicted to the success. You started taking more overtime. You skipped your vacation days because one more week of work is another piece of furniture for the house. You convinced yourself that your absence was a currency. The more you stayed away, the more they could have. You were trading your soul for square footage.
The most painful part was the language of things. Since you weren't there to teach your son how to ride a bike, how to handle a bully, or how to speak to a girl, you taught him how to want things. You created a version of him that was hungry for the next upgrade, the next brand, the status symbol. You thought you were giving him an advantage. You didn't realize you were creating a version of yourself, a person who thinks value is measured in price tags. By the time he was a teenager, he didn't need your advice. He didn't need your stories about the struggle. He just needed the Wi-Fi password and a bigger allowance. One night you called home and he didn't even pick up. Your wife answered. "He's out with his friends, Elias. He's 15 now. He doesn't want to sit in front of a computer talking to his dad." That was the night the "who are you" question first started to form in the shadows. You realized that your son had a whole world that you knew nothing about. He had jokes you didn't get, friends you had never met, and dreams that didn't include you. You were the silent partner in his life. You were the sponsor of a movie you weren't allowed to watch. You looked at your hands. They were calloused and scarred. You had sacrificed your health, your youth, and your best years. For what? For a house you didn't live in? For a son who saw you as a bank? You felt a wave of anger, but then you realized you chose this. Every time you stayed for the extra shift instead of booking a flight home, you made a choice. Every time you sent a gadget instead of yourself, you made a choice. You were the architect of your own loneliness. You thought you were building a bridge to a better life, but you were actually building a high-tech cage. The digital shadow had finally swallowed you whole. You were no longer a father. You were a provider. You were no longer a husband. You were a paycheck. And as you sat there in the dark, watching the clock on the wall tick away the minutes of your life, you realized the most terrifying thing of all. If you stopped sending the money tomorrow, would they even have a reason to call you at all? You had won the dream. You had conquered New York, but you had become a stranger to the only people who were supposed to know your name. Man in the mirror was a success, but the man in the heart was a ghost.
The moment you step off that plane, the air doesn't taste like freedom. It tastes like debt. You are walking through the airport of your home country, and for the first time in 20 years, you don't have a return ticket in your pocket. You have retired. You have made it. You're carrying a suitcase full of expensive watches, perfumes, and clothes, the final peace offerings for a 2-decade absence. You expect the air to feel familiar, but it feels heavy. You expect the people to look at you and see a hero returning from the front lines of the American dream. But as you walk through the arrivals gate, you realize the most painful truth of all. The world didn't stop spinning just because you weren't there to see it. You take a taxi to the address of the mansion you've been paying for. As the car turns into the driveway, you see it. The white pillars, the manicured lawn, the heavy oak door. It is exactly what you saw in the photos. It is the physical manifestation of every hour of overtime, every missed meal, and every back-breaking shift in New York. You should feel proud. You should feel like a king entering his castle. But as you stand in front of that door, you feel like a ghost trying to haunt a house that has already been exorcised of your memory. You ring the bell. The door opens, and there is the boy, the man who destroyed your soul with those 3 words, "Who are you?" After the initial shock, after your wife comes to the door and explains through tears and awkward smiles that this is your father, you finally step inside. You walk across the marble floors you bought. You sit on the Italian leather sofa you financed, but you don't feel like the owner. You feel like a guest who stayed too long at a party where he wasn't invited. You look around the living room and you see the empty chair. It's not a literal chair. It's the space in the room where a father's influence should matter. It's the gap in the conversation where your opinion should matter. It's the void in your son's eyes where respect should live. You try to reclaim your spot. You sit at the head of the dining table during dinner. You look at your son who is busy texting on his phone, the newest model, the one you sent him 6 months ago. You want him to tell him a story. You want him to tell him about the time you almost got fired in New York because you stayed on the phone too long listening to him cry about a scraped knee. You want him to know the price of the food he is eating. But when you open your mouth, you realize you don't know how to talk to him. What do you say to a man whose entire childhood you missed?
Do you ask about his favorite color? He's 19. He doesn't care about colors. Do you ask about his dreams? He's already living them on your bank account. Every time you try to start a sentence, it feels forced. It feels like you're trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. You realize that you know his shoe size, you know his blood type, and you know his bank balance, but you don't know him. And the terrifying reality is, he doesn't want to know you. You look at your wife. She is kind. She makes you tea. She asks if you like the house, but she moves through the rooms with a confidence that tells you she doesn't need your help. For 20 years, she was the mother and the father. She made the decisions. She fixed the leaks. She dealt with the teachers. She comforted the broken hearts. She has a rhythm to her life, a routine that was built in your absence. When you try to give an opinion on the house or the finances, she listens politely, but you can see it in her eyes. You are an outsider interfering in a well-oiled machine. You are the investor, not the partner. You provided the capital, but she provided the life.
The most silent part of the house is your son's room. You go there at night, standing in the doorway while he's out with his friends. The room is a museum of your guilt. Every corner is filled with things you sent. The high-end computer, the designer sneakers, the rows of expensive watches. You see the old steel watch you left him 20 years ago. It's sitting at the back of a shelf, covered in dust, buried behind a pair of limited edition Jordans. It's a metaphor for your relationship. The promise you made is buried under the things you provided. You realize that by giving him everything he wanted, you made sure he never valued anything you gave. You hear a car pull into the driveway. It's the car you bought him for his graduation. You hear the loud music, the laughter of his friends, the slamming of the doors. You wait for him to come inside. You want to have the talk. You want to bridge the gap. He walks in, smelling of expensive cologne and the outside world. He sees you standing there, and he stops. The smile disappears from his face. It's replaced by that polite, distant mask. "Oh, hey," he says. "You're still up?" "I wanted to talk to you, Leo," you say. Your voice sounds small in the large house. "Can it wait, Dad? I'm wiped. We're going to the beach tomorrow." "I missed 20 years of tomorrows, Leo. Can I just have 10 minutes? He sighs. It's a heavy, impatient sigh. He sits on the edge of the sofa, looking at his watch. Your watch. "Look, I get it. You worked hard. You sent money. We're grateful, okay? The house is great. My car is great. But what do you want from me? You want me to act like we're best friends? I don't even remember what your voice sounded like before the video calls started getting laggy." The words are like a physical blow to the stomach. You want to scream that you did it for him. You want to show him the scars on your hands and the ache in your back. But you look at his face and you see the truth. He didn't ask for the mansion. He didn't ask for the designer clothes. He asked for a father. And when you weren't there, he filled that hole with the things you sent. You taught him that love is a commodity. You taught him that dad is a person who signs checks from a distance. You can't be mad at him for learning the lesson you taught him for 20 years. You spend the next few weeks trying to buy your way back in. You suggest family trips. You offer to buy him a better car. You try to use the only tool you have left, money. But it doesn't work anymore. The currency of the American dream has no value in a heart that has already turned to stone. You realize that you are competing with 20 years of your own absence, and you are losing. Every time you try to be a father, you just end up being an ATM. One evening, you sit on the porch alone. You look at the neighborhood. Every house is big.
Every house was built by a man like you, a man who went away to save his family. You realize the whole street is a graveyard of fathers, a row of beautiful houses filled with strangers. You see the other men walking their dogs, men who returned years before you, and you see the same look in their eyes, the look of a man who realized too late that you can't save a family by leaving it. You go back inside and look at the empty chair at the table. You realize that you will never truly sit in that chair. You will live in this house until the day you die, but you will always be the guest. You will be the man they take care of out of duty, not out of love. You will be the man who paid for the wedding, but won't know what to say during the toast. You will be the grandfather that the grandkids don't want to visit because you're too quiet and too serious. You realize that the 20 years wasn't a sacrifice for your family. It was a sacrifice of your family. You traded the messy, loud, beautiful reality of a growing child for the cold, hard, silent reality of a bank balance. You won the game of success, but you failed the test of fatherhood. You look at the mirror in the hallway. You see an old man with expensive clothes and a broken spirit. You realize that the American dream is a mirror that shows you what you want to see until you get it, and then it shows you exactly what you lost. You are home. The house is beautiful, the yard is green, the bank account is full. But as you listen to the silence of the mansion, you realize that the most expensive thing you ever bought was your own loneliness. And as the sun sets over the house you built, you finally understand the weight of the 3 words your son gave you. You aren't just a stranger to him. You are a stranger to yourself. You spent 20 years becoming a provider, and in the process, you forgot how to be a human being.
You sit in the dark, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, the one you paid for. You think about the tiny, leaky apartment 20 years ago. You think about the smell of onions and the sound of your son's laughter. You realize you would give every brick of this mansion, every dollar in that account, and every designer shirt in the closet just to go back to that one night, just to stay in that room, just to be the poor man who was actually a father. But time doesn't take bribes. It doesn't care about your overtime. It just ticks away, leaving you with a house full of things and a heart full of who are you? You thought the hardest part was the 80-hour work weeks. You thought the hardest part was the cold New York winters or the loneliness of a shared apartment. But you were wrong. The hardest part is sitting in a 5-bedroom mansion and realizing that you are the only thing in it that doesn't belong. Look at your hands. They are the hands of a man who won. You have the gold watch. You have the deed to the land. You have the respect of every man in your village who wishes they could be you. But when you look at those hands, all you see is what they dropped 20 years ago. You see the toddler you didn't hold. You see the tears you didn't wipe away. You see the man your son became without a single piece of your DNA in his character. You realize now that providing was the easy part. Writing a check is easy. Sending a box of clothes is easy. Working until your back breaks is easy compared to the hard work of being present. You used the dream as an excuse to run away from the terrifying responsibility of being a father. You told yourself it was for them, but deep down, was it? Or was it because you were afraid of being poor more than you were afraid of being a stranger? You walk into the living room one last time before bed. You see your son's graduation photo on the mantel. He's smiling. He looks confident. He looks like a success. But as you stare at that photo,
you notice something that breaks what's left of your heart. In the background of the photo, standing next to him, is his uncle, or maybe his mother's friend, or maybe a teacher. Whoever it is, that person is the one Leo is leaning toward. That person is the one who knows the story of how Leo got that diploma. You are just the guy who paid the tuition. You finally understand the cruelest joke of the American dream. You can't buy a memory. You can't backdate an I love you. You can't deposit 20 years of absence into a bank and expect to withdraw a relationship. Time is the only currency that doesn't have an exchange rate. Once you spend it in New York, you can't spend it at home. So you sit there in the silence of your success. You hear the hum of the expensive refrigerator. You feel the soft fabric of the expensive sofa. And you realize that you are the most successful failure you've ever known. You gave your son a life of luxury, but you gave him the heart of an orphan. You built a house so big that you can go all day without seeing your family. And the terrifying thing is, they prefer it that way. To anyone watching this, anyone who is currently packing their bags, anyone who is saying just 2 more years for the 10th year in a row, stop. Look at your kids while they are still small enough to want your hug. Look at your wife while she still remembers why she fell in love with you.